I'm so glad to see you all here. I'm Valerie Golden. I'm the president of the Candidates Council of the American Psychoanalytic, and it is my distinct pleasure to welcome Dr. Anton Kris today for he is our 2017 recipient of the Candidates Council Master Teacher Award. And just to give you a tiny bit of history, I promise I won't talk long because I want you to hear him. The Master Teacher Award arose out of, it is the only award the candidates give, and it arose out of the recognition that every single one of us came to a career in psychoanalysis because someone, like Dr. Kris, had inspired us through their teaching. And so the Candidates Council wanted to, in recognition of that, create an award and an archive. So this will be videotaped, but we wanted to create an archive for future generations of the really people we think of as master teachers. We wished we would have that of some of those who've gone before. So Dr. Kris does not need a big introduction, and obviously, looks like everyone knows, but he is a renowned analyst, teacher, author, has been a psychiatrist for 55 years and an analyst for more than 55 years and an analyst for more than 45 years. No small feat, right? He's a professor of psychiatry, now part-time, at Harvard Medical School, and has been a training analyst and supervising analyst at the Boston Psychoanalytic Society and Institute for over 35 years. He's the author of the famous book, Free Association Method and Process, and articles, papers too numerous to mention. But just this month, there is a paper being published that summarizes his work on conflict, and it's being published in a book titled Psychoanalytic Perspectives on Conflict, and it's just coming out. It's edited by Christian, Eagle, and Wolitsky. He has served on the editorial boards of several major psychoanalytic journals. He's currently the chair of the Monitoring and Advisory Board of the International Journal of Psychoanalysis. He's been a trustee of the Anna Freud Center, the Anna Freud Foundation, and the Sigmund Freud Archives, of which he was the executive director 2 years ago. In 2015, he received the Massachusetts Psychiatric Society's Lifetime Achievement Awards, and he is a very humble guy who doesn't like the designation master teacher, but he regards himself as more of a teacher than an innovator, and he absolutely, positively embodies all the qualities of a master teacher. So I'm delighted to turn him over to him, and thank you for coming, Dr. Kris. We're so happy to have you.
This year I'm going to read you a little paper. It's called Love's Not Time's Fool. Some Continuities, Discontinuities, and Alterations in Psychoanalysis During My Lifetime. The first part of the title of this lecture, Love's Not Time's Fool, will be familiar to you from Shakespeare's sonnet 116 on the constancy of love. It is placed here to represent the enduring significance of the founding principles and facts of psychoanalysis, and also my own love for psychoanalysis, which refers, of course, also to my love for my family, which was so closely bound to it. I hope to examine some ways in which psychoanalysis in North America has changed since the time I would regularly visit Freud's couch in 1933 and 34. My mother was his patient, and her pregnancy gave me, let us say, an embryonic experience of psychoanalysis. She told me of her first session with Freud some years earlier, in which she had revealed all her doubts, fears, and inhibitions. At the end of that hour, Freud, who had known her literally all her life, said, "I have always liked you. Now I like you still better. It is currently fashionable to criticize Freud for his analysis of his daughter, Anna. I do not share that attitude, but in any case, his analysis of the daughter of his intimate friend Oscar Ree, my grandfather, was decidedly beneficial. Psychoanalysis in North America in the 1930s was theory-driven. 25 years ago, preparing for a seminar, I hoped to understand the way analysts worked by extracting their views from their clinical accounts. Surprisingly, I could find no accounts of clinical interaction in either the English or the German literature in the 1930s. Fenichel's papers on technique, later a book, are repeatedly referenced during those years, rather than present clinical material. A few years ago, the 6 volumes of transcriptions of the first electronically recorded psychoanalysis, which was conducted in Worcester, Massachusetts, and New Haven between the autumn of 1933 and the spring of 1936, fell into my hands and are now safely in the library of the Boston Psychoanalytic Society and Institute. The analyst, Mr. Earl Zinn of New York City, and later of the anthropology department at the Institute of Human Relations at Yale, a master's graduate of the Department of Psychology of G. Stanley Hall at Clark University, briefly trained at Berlin Psychoanalytic Institute, became a strong proponent of research in psychoanalysis and corresponded with Ernest Jones, Freud, and Edward Bibring. I must leave to a future occasion the full study of these 6 volumes, which I intend to undertake, and the extraordinary unpublished work of the anthropologist Jeffrey Gora on the patient's life and background, none of which has received significant attention. To illustrate the actual interaction in the psychoanalysis of the 1930s, I will confine myself here to a few of Earl Zinn's communications to his patient Tom, an intellectually aware and interested 20-year-old man, greatly troubled by sexual guilt and ideas of influence that he could not understand and could not dispel. He was admitted to Worcester State Hospital with a diagnosis of schizophrenia, but far from totally disorganized. The outcome was relatively successful, with the patient able to gain employment and live without treatment. Mr. Zinn's opening statement repeated many times that Tom should say whatever comes to his mind so that the two of them can understand the unconscious thoughts that are assumed to be the basis of Tom's illness, reflects his belief that eliciting pathogenic unconscious thoughts will effect a cure. He interprets the thoughts expressed selectively to show underlying Oedipal conflicts of childhood, which he assumes are repressed. Inviting the patient to join him in research, Mr. Zinn begins in his usual friendly way. I should like you to come here every day for an hour and lie down on the couch and just tell me everything that comes into your mind. Just come here and talk your thoughts right out. I must refrain from commenting on those aspects of the patient's condition that are painfully missed by this approach. In the moments of personal interchange, however, about Mr. Zinn's travels to New York in his automobile or about books, the patient comes to life. The rest of the time, he attempts compliantly to follow Mr. Zinn's directions, but he emphasizes that he has lost something, that he has nothing worthwhile to say. I can't make things seem real, he says. In a subsequent session, Mr. Zinn clarifies his aims when the patient asks, well, do you call these thoughts when I just speak like this? Are those thoughts? Yes, says Mr. Zinn, those are all thoughts. you will say, well, these are things I'm just talking, but there are other thoughts in back of those things. You said the last time you were here, I have thoughts that I want to try to get out, but I can't get them out. Well, it's those two that we want to get out. They're all thoughts, but some thoughts are back of other thoughts. A couple of sessions later, the patient speaks of feeling guilty eating in the cafeteria. When Mr. Zinn presses the patient, the associations lead to home, mother, babies, and women who are always on his mind. The patient is reluctant to speak, feels he is getting thoughts from outside. The idea that he may possibly object to Mr. Zinn's thoughts from outside does not occur to Mr. Zinn, and I believe was not part of an analyst's theory at that time. Mr. Zinn does recognize that at times the patient is afraid of him and reluctant to speak with him, as he would have been to speak with his parents. Mr. Zinn comments. Well, I can tell you something about those ideas. We want to see where those ideas are coming from. They're coming from that part of your personality that has told you that all these things that you would like to do, would like to be, are wrong. That's a part of your personality that is trying to prevent you, yourself, your real self, from taking charge of the situation. That part of your personality is saying to you that you shouldn't come here, and after you've come here and expressed your thoughts and wishes, then that part of your personality, which is at the moment trying to get the better of you, is trying to convince you, the real you, that this is all wrong. A battle is being fought, and one side makes some gain, and then that side loses ground and the other side gains. One of the sides in this conflict is yourself, your real self, and the other is, well, conscience. Only a conscience that has become terrifyingly severe, all out of proportion, that is causing you all this trouble. But I think we can understand how your experiences in life from very early infancy up to the present time have contributed to the formation of such a conscience. Our work here will be, for some time at least, directed toward trying to find out why that very severe conscience should have developed. That's a fairly long interpretive comment. I trust you don't do that. Structural considerations and the development of conscience are part of Mr. Zinn's theoretical viewpoint. Strikingly, he seems to feel he knows what is going on with his patient and wishes to convey that certainty to his patient. It will be evident to you that he is not aware of the extent to which he is encouraging the patient and trying to influence him by education and suggestion rather than by creating insight through a process. On the other hand, a few sessions later, after telling the patient the day before that he would be away for a few days, he understands correctly that the patient is expressing sadness and resentment at Mr. Zinn's leaving. As with the technique of that time, however, he immediately tied this experience to the patient's presumed childhood feelings of being left by mother. It is worth noting that although the analyst is ignoring the patient's central experience of not being himself, in a mere 9 sessions, Mr. Zinn's departure matters to Tom. The warm and friendly relationship between analyst and patient, in Mr. Zinn's case an invitation to join in research, sharing cigarettes, repeated encouragement, in the 1930s, gave way in the course of a few years to a so-called neutral relationship, in which the analyst remained as much as possible undefined as a person. This technical change, it seems to me, came about principally in the service of transference analysis. The illusion that the unknown analyst would provide a blank screen, an idea of Freud's that contrasted very sharply with his own behavior as an analyst. The question of how much psychoanalysis relies on transference cures rather than on transference analysis cannot be settled by fiat or by a wish to be perfectly scientific. At a time when analysts, at Freud's behest, were trying to make psychoanalysis more scientific in a positivistic sense, the shift to pure transference analysis was accompanied by a belief that the analyst represented reality and could make objective appraisals, an attitude that has come to be known as immaculate perception. The reversal of that view and the understanding of the analyst as a participant observer has been the most important change in psychoanalysis during my lifetime. But I'm getting ahead of my story. The first of the major developments that I want to take up is the full elaboration of the structural point of view, known, unfortunately, as ego psychology, as though all else had been forgotten. It may be worth recalling that this development was not the work of graybeards, but of analysts in their 30s and 40s. The important new interest in the way the ego functions led to a very different sort of analysis than the earlier aim of psychoanalysis merely to identify unconscious conflict and reverse repression. Mr. Zinn's interest in Tom's repressed infantile conflicts led him away from Tom's central experience of thought transfer and derealization, although, as noted, he was concerned with the severe quality of his conscience. I believe that, much criticized as it is today, ego psychology provided the platform for all subsequent analytic work. The integration of the structural point of view, whether one thinks of it as the whole of psychoanalytic theory or one of several points of view, facilitated the shift from the earlier exclusively topographic dynamic concept of the lifting of repression. It gave a new understanding of the hitherto rather vague and shifting ideas about working through, and it permitted the formulation of the genetic and developmental points of view. While initially these ideas were put forward rather starkly and dogmatically, and God knows that's the story of our profession, they have become background understanding for all schools of psychoanalytic thought. Objections to the structural point of view, I believe, derive from two principal failures: the lack of sufficient attention to early pre-Oedipal development, although the work of Phyllis Greenacre was an important exception, and the inadequate exploration of countertransference. Those are the two most important failures of that work. These were soon to become the subject of significant contributions, starting with Melanie Klein, from analysts in the UK and in South America. Their influence did not extend to North America, however, for roughly another 20 years, even though Jappa published Leo Stone's paper on the widening scope of psychoanalysis with Anna Freud's endorsement, and Edith Jacobson's work on depressive patients in 1954. When those contributions came, they brought with them eventually profound alterations in our view of the analyst as participant observer and the complex ideas of a two-person psychoanalytic psychology and psychoanalytic field theory. The Kleinian views offered a line of connection to the contributions of Harry Stack Sullivan, though it would be many decades before that opportunity was grasped. Edgar Levinson's powerful, acerbic critique of ego psychology contributed to the eventual rapprochement between classical and relational psychoanalysts, with important later contributions from Stephen Mitchell and his colleagues. Levenson's writings were tough reading in the 60s and 70s. The analyst as a new object, not only as a transference figure, an idea connected for me with the writings of Hans Lowald, is an important feature of the changes, though I believe we did not fully appreciate its revolutionary nature in the 1960s. The recognition and understanding of enactments, or better, enactment as an ordinary part of analysis, is by now entirely accepted, although it radically altered the classical approach. The same is the case for projective identification, a concept none of us can do without. All in all, here and now analysis has taken center stage with great benefit from the work of Betty Joseph. Views of transference and countertransference did not change all at once. Even in the 1960s, in Boston, which is where I trained, countertransference was seen in the old way, as interference, as grounds for a turn to analysis for purification. I recall with some embarrassment trying to deny my anger at my second analytic patient who persistently lied. Fortunately, my attempts at self-control were not entirely successful, and the analysis proceeded slowly to a very satisfactory conclusion after some fairly hefty confrontations early on. In that era, reverence for authority kept schools apart. In Boston in the 1960s, relying on Rappaport's characterization of the mad language of the Kleinians, we did not read much of the important work of Melanie Klein and her followers, or of Bion and the Barangers, which was not available in English then. Although Winnicott was already popular and his influence moved slowly westward. I remember one time somebody saying at a meeting, "Winnicott has arrived in Denver." Cultural developments in the late 1960s, however, greatly altered authoritarian positions in American psychoanalysis. Our discourse became more ecumenical and civil, slowly, but did. Xenophobia very slowly reduced its impact. I want to mention in passing a few major contributions from different sides that bridged gaps. Otto Kernberg demonstrated the value of his own version of object relations theory. Heinrich Racker, especially after his early death, greatly influenced us in grasping the new approach to countertransference. Heinz Kohut, with his emphasis on the value of empathy, radically altered the psychoanalytic attitude. I have argued that much of Kohut's contribution can be understood as providing an alternative to the patient's punitive, unconscious self-criticism. Paradoxically, although ego psychologists, under the salutary influence of Anna Freud, claimed to take a position equidistant from ego, superego, and id, they sided for many decades with the patient's punitive superego. A bit earlier, Mr. Zinn, as you will recall, took a position much closer to Kohut's. That is, before the severity of the 40s and 50s. Another aspect of Freud's theoretical position formed a counterweight to the changes that were occurring. It is a great paradox of Freud's psychoanalysis to have produced a major revision in the understanding of reality, but to hold strictly, even rigidly, to absolute determinism. Freud's view of the analytic interaction as a conversation ultimately between one unconscious and another was constrained by the requirement that both were under the rule of determinism. The enormous heuristic value of that perspective in the study of unconscious influences on conscious mental life required reassessment as psychoanalysis came to terms with its intrinsic revision of positivistic science. Strachey's translation of Ich as ego, under the supervision of a group that included Freud himself, and Freud's English was superb, reflects the attempt to retain a positivistic psychoanalysis. The slow and at times tortured route to the recognition of the analyst's subjectivity was, however, aided by developments in philosophy and the rise of relativism. The tension between certainty and uncertainty in many variations has contributed to the recurrent arrogance that has often blighted the reputation of psychoanalysts. Another of the very important changes in psychoanalysis in the 1960s and 1970s, coming especially from child psychoanalysis and developmental studies, was the recognition of the importance of attachment, separation, and loss. The work of Winnicott, Margaret Mahler, and Anna Freud contributed greatly, but we owe most to John Bowlby. In the course of my life, including my training, I've had 3 psychoanalysts, all trained before this important change. None of them ever paid attention to the traumatic experience of my separation from my parents when I was 5 years old. It was just not part of their working vocabulary, although it was in the books, and Mr. Zinn had invoked it in 1933 as a contributing factor in the development of Tom's severe conscience. Personal experiences and some theoretical ideas of my own about mourning have helped me to master that problem over the subsequent 50 years. A reminder that there is life after analysis. Right along with the awareness of separation and loss came the reintroduction of trauma into psychoanalytic thought and practice. The sometimes narrow view of a drive conflict-only psychoanalytic psychology gave way to a more complex and, I believe, more realistic understanding of human development and of the relationship between external and internal influences on the mind. Another quite different line of progress has been in the understanding of development altogether and the radical alteration in the psychoanalytic understanding of female development. Here, once again, the cultural revolution of the 1960s contributed a major change. The long, painful, but proud history of the women's movement has largely overcome the psychoanalytic misogyny that began with a view of women as incomplete men. Although Sigmund Freud produced a great step forward in truly listening to women, his theorizing required more than the better part of a century for revision. The mistreatment of women by men in psychoanalysis, through what is called euphemistically boundary violation, remains a major, all too frequent problem. The recognition that homosexuality lies beyond the grasp of psychoanalytic explanation alone has reduced an area in which too many patients were damaged by theory-driven misadventures. This does not mean that psychoanalytic understanding has no place with regard to homosexual fantasy. Witness my heterosexual patient who told me after several years of analysis that he had always been afraid that I would jump him. And surely it is an important part of the treatment of adolescents and young adults. I recall with chagrin my sense of failure 40 years ago when a young man took his first step into active homosexuality in the course of treatment. Today, I would see that as part of a successful development. But with the fortunate assistance of cultural change, psychoanalysis has backed off from its sometimes arrogant, judgmental views on what is perverse and what is permissible variation. The origins of the modern position are plainly to be found in Freud's 3 essays on the theory of sexuality. Another area of significant change has come in our understanding of action. There was a time when, following Freud, thought was seen as experimental action. Today we are inclined to think that action may also be experimental thought. Within psychoanalytic treatment, action was regarded as the very opposite of free association, a manifestation of resistance rather than, as is often, an attempt to express, just as a perversion was seen in the opposite of neurosis. Did that come across? Let's try that one again. Within psychoanalytic treatment, action was regarded as the very opposite of free association, a manifestation of resistance, rather than, as it often is, an attempt at expression, just as perversion was seen as the opposite of neurosis. Several authors, most notably Roy Schaefer and Merton Gill, focused on words as actions and on the many varieties of action within psychoanalytic treatment. Where once psychoanalysts thought insight based on verbal interpretation was the exclusive means of psychoanalytic therapeutic action, today we are keenly aware of the nonverbal contributions to the analytic process. We are also aware that action often precedes the development of insight. A last change, one introduced by my father, was the recognition that contributions to psychoanalysis can come from outside the analytic setting. We no longer share the image of the tabula rasa baby of Freud's first formulations, though we recognize its heuristic value in Freud's attempts to distinguish ego development from id. And the powerful, really recurrent desire to link psychoanalysis with neurobiology, again to produce a truly scientific psychoanalysis, requires both vigor to pursue it and caution, lest we create, in the immortal words of Yogi Berra, déjà vu all over again. One could, of course, draw many more historical lines and include many more instances of continuities, discontinuities, and alterations in psychoanalysis. In my own practice, I have returned to the friendlier version of psychoanalysis. Praise, encouragement, and humor have a place in what I do, in the service of a developing analytic process. I rely particularly on alertness to the patient's punitive self-criticism to facilitate the analytic process and prevent its derailment. As always, however, the analytic relationship remains necessarily asymmetrical. We are there to help our patients achieve their aims, not unaware of the adversarial side of the analytic relationship so clearly illuminated by Lawrence Friedman. I see analysis as a cooperative venture, and it is extremely rare for me to feel that the patient is opposing the treatment. The misunderstanding of resistance and negative transference as opposition to treatment, which Freud introduced early on, seems utterly counterproductive to me. For me, resistance is the unconscious opposition to freedom of association. Resistance is unconscious opposition. The elucidation and resolution of unconscious conflict remains central to my practice of psychoanalysis. The great advantages of the relational tilt in American psychoanalysis have, in some hands, unfortunately, been accompanied by avoidance of the body, relegation of sexuality to a footnote, and neglect of problems deriving from Oedipal and post-Oedipal development. Similarly, reconstruction and even construction, which I find useful and essential tools, particularly in helping patients regain empathy for themselves, have been sidelined by some analysts out of an overzealous concern for the here and now. though analysis today does take place much more in the present than in the past. With a perennial optimism derived from somewhere, perhaps from my days on Freud's couch, I prefer to think that each new trend in psychoanalysis has been overstated and that a period of adaptation must continue to take place gradually. Adaptation may have maladaptive consequences, however, but I hope and believe they will be temporary. So I have come to the end of my story, or let us say, to put it optimistically, my story so far.